I came home from the hospital the same night my father died, and the first thing I saw when I pulled into the driveway was my brother-in-law's truck, parked crooked across the lawn. Not in the driveway, on the lawn. Like he'd been in such a hurry to get there that steering properly was too much effort. My father had been gone for maybe 4 hours. I sat in my car for a moment, engine still running, staring at that truck. My hands were still shaking from signing the paperwork at the hospital. I had a paper bag on the passenger seat with his watch, his reading glasses, and the cardigan he'd been wearing when they admitted him 3 weeks ago. And I just sat there because something in my stomach already knew that whatever was happening inside that house was not grief. My name is Simone. I'm 31 years old, and for the past 2 years, I had been my father's primary caregiver. I'm a licensed CPA, a certified public accountant, and I work for a mid-size forensic audit firm in Columbus, Ohio. I say that because it matters later. It matters a lot. My father, Walter, was 73. He'd had a stroke 18 months before he passed, and after that, the doctors were honest with us. Recovery would be partial, assisted living would eventually be necessary, and his affairs needed to be in order sooner rather than later. I was the one who moved back. I was the one who converted the downstairs office into a bedroom, who learned how to operate his feeding tube for the first 2 months, who drove him to physical therapy 4 days a week and sat in that waiting room with my laptop, billing client hours from a plastic chair. My younger sister Cora had 3 kids and lived 40 minutes away. My brother lived in Phoenix and came to visit exactly twice in 18 months. My father's second wife, my stepmother, a woman he'd married 6 years ago, had her own apartment, her own life, and her own very convenient habit of being unavailable whenever things got difficult. That was the arrangement. I made it work because I loved him and because someone had to. What I did not know, what none of us knew, was that my father had been quietly managing a substantial amount of money for most of his adult life. He was not flashy about it. He drove an 11-year-old Buick. He clipped grocery coupons, but he had also worked in commercial insurance for 35 years, invested carefully, bought a piece of land in rural Tennessee in 1987 that had since tripled in value, and maintained 2 income properties in a Columbus suburb that he'd owned outright since the 90s. When I finally sat down with his estate attorney 3 days before he passed, when it became clear we were in the final stretch, the number I saw on that document made me grip the edge of the conference table. $2.4 million. Plus the land. Plus the properties. My father had spent his whole life looking like a man who fixed his own gutters because he enjoyed it. Turns out, he enjoyed it because the money was going somewhere else. He left the majority of it to me. Not because I was his favorite. He told me that specifically in the letter his attorney read aloud, which almost broke me completely. But because, he wrote, I was the one who showed up. He left Cora a fair portion. He left my brother a smaller sum. And he left my stepmother a single property, the smaller of the 2 rentals, and nothing else. I walked out of that attorney's office holding a folder I could barely process, drove straight to the hospital, held my father's hand for the last time, and watched him go quietly at 9:47 in the evening. By 2 a.m., my brother-in-law's truck was on my father's lawn. I didn't go inside right away. Something made me stop on the porch, and I'm grateful it did, because the front window was cracked open. My father always ran hot, and had never gotten around to fixing the storm window latch. And I could hear everything. My brother-in-law was talking. He has one of those voices that carries, the kind that's always performing for a room even when the room is just a kitchen. He was saying something about getting ahead of the paperwork. My stepmother's voice answered him, lower, sharper. She said the will hadn't been filed yet and that there was still time to make a case. Then my sister Cora spoke, and that's the part that stopped my breathing entirely. She said, Simone controlled everything. She controlled his medications, she controlled who visited, she controlled what he signed. We have grounds. Make a case. Grounds. My father had been dead for less than 5 hours, and they were already using legal language. I stood on that porch in the dark, in the clothes I'd worn to the hospital, still holding the bag with his cardigan in it, and I listened to them plan. My brother-in-law laid it out like he'd been rehearsing. He had a contact, a family law attorney, who specialized in will contests. The argument would be undue influence. that I had isolated my father during his illness and manipulated him into changing his estate documents in my favor. My stepmother would be the primary petitioner because she had standing as a spouse. Cora would corroborate. My brother, still in Phoenix, would sign whatever they needed him to sign. The plan was to file a contest before the will entered probate, freeze the estate assets, and force a settlement. My brother-in-law actually put a number on it out loud in my dead father's kitchen, that they could probably pressure me into surrendering 60 to 70% of the estate just to avoid the legal fees and the emotional cost of fighting. She's already exhausted, my sister said. She's been running on empty for 2 years. She won't want to fight. I stood there for another full minute. Then I walked back to my car, sat down, and called my work colleague Patrick, who handles litigation support for our firm, and who I trust more than almost anyone. I told him what I'd just heard. He was quiet for a second and then he said, "Don't go back in that house tonight, get a hotel, and text me your father's attorney's name." I did both of those things. What they didn't know, what my sister, my brother-in-law, and my stepmother could not have anticipated, was that my job had made me deeply, almost pathologically, careful about documentation. I don't make a significant financial decision without a paper trail. I don't sign anything without reading it twice. And when I took over my father's care, I had treated it the same way I treated a client engagement. Every medication log, every physician visit, every conversation where my father made a decision about his own care or his own finances. I had notes, I had timestamps, I had emails confirming that his estate attorney had met with him privately, without me present, specifically to ensure there was no undue influence. His attorney had required it. It's standard practice for elderly clients with significant assets and multiple heirs. I had a paper trail 2 years long, and every single page of it said the same thing. Walter made his own decisions, clearly and deliberately, until the very end. That night in the hotel, I didn't sleep. I opened my laptop and started building the file. The next morning, I met with my father's estate attorney at 8 o'clock. His name is Mr. Adebayo, and he is meticulous in the way that only someone who has seen every variety of family ugliness can be. I told him what I'd heard. He was not surprised. He told me will contests from disgruntled heirs are extraordinarily common in estates of this size. But he was also not concerned. He had already anticipated the undue influence argument. He had documentation of his independent meetings with my father. He had a note in the file that Walter had specifically requested the distribution be structured the way it was, and had signed a statement of intent to that effect. "They can file," Mr. Adebayo said, folding his hands on his desk. "They have the right to contest, but they have very little to stand on." I asked him what I should do in the meantime. He told me to act normal. Go through the motions of grief. Don't telegraph that I'd overheard anything. Let them believe their plan was still a surprise. So I did. The funeral was 4 days later. I planned it. I paid for it. I stood at the front of the room and gave the eulogy because no one else offered, and I talked about my father's laugh and his terrible taste in television and the way he used to fall asleep in the recliner with a book still open on his chest, and I meant every word of it. Cora sat in the front row with her husband and cried in a way that seemed real. My stepmother wore a black dress that was slightly too formal for the venue and accepted condolences with her hand pressed to her chest. My brother-in-law did not come to the funeral. He said he had a work conflict. I noted that absence. It told me he'd already transitioned from grieving family to opposing party. 3 days after the funeral, I received a certified letter. They had filed. The contest alleged undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity. My father supposedly hadn't been mentally competent to execute his estate documents due to his post-stroke condition. They had attached a statement from a doctor I had never heard of, someone who had reviewed my father's hospital records remotely and concluded there were questions about his cognitive state. I read the letter sitting at my father's kitchen table, which was now my table, in the house I was living in while the estate moved through probate. I read it twice, carefully, the way I read everything. Then I set it down, poured myself a cup of coffee, and picked up my phone. I called Patrick first. Then I called a contact of mine at the Ohio Board of Medical Licensing. Because here's the thing about hiring a doctor to review records and issue an opinion supporting a legal challenge, the doctor's own record becomes relevant. And I'm a forensic accountant. Finding things people want hidden is quite literally my profession. It took Patrick and me one evening of database work to find what we needed. The physician they had hired to question my father's competency had 2 prior complaints filed with the state licensing board, both related to providing professional opinions in legal cases without adequate clinical foundation. He had never examined my father. He had never spoken to any of my father's treating physicians. He had billed my stepmother's attorney $4,500 for a 5-page report based exclusively on records review. I had that information to Mr. Adebayo by the following morning. Meanwhile, I let Cora believe things were proceeding on her end. She texted me twice that week, not to check on me, not to ask how I was doing after burying our father, but to ask how I was handling everything, in a tone that I recognized as fishing for information. I responded warmly and vaguely both times. I told her I was taking it one day at a time. I told her I missed Dad. I did not tell her about the licensing board findings. I did not tell her that I had already spent 12 hours reconstructing a complete financial and medical timeline that would make the undue influence argument essentially impossible to sustain. I also did not tell her that I had quietly changed the locks on the house. Because on a Tuesday evening I was having dinner with a friend across town, and my home security system sent an alert to my phone. Motion detected at the back entrance. I pulled up the camera feed from the app and watched my stepmother and Cora let themselves into the house using the spare key my father had kept under the ceramic frog by the back steps, a hiding spot they apparently knew about. I watched them move through the rooms. They weren't rushing. They were methodical. My stepmother went to my father's study. Cora went upstairs. They were looking for something, and I had a very specific idea of what. My father had kept paper files. Old school. Labeled manila folders in a lateral cabinet in his study. Among those files were his insurance policy documents, old property deeds, and most importantly from their perspective, any earlier drafts of his will that might show a different distribution and support the claim that I had influenced him to change it. What they didn't know was that I had already removed everything from that cabinet 3 weeks before he passed, when it became clear we were getting close. I'd moved all of it to a secure storage unit and replaced the folders with blank paper, clearly labeled, to maintain the appearance of a full cabinet. My stepmother spent 11 minutes in that study. On the camera, I could see her open the cabinet, flip through the folders, and grow visibly agitated when she found nothing. She pulled out her phone, probably texting my brother-in-law, and then moved to the desk drawers. Cora came back downstairs empty-handed. They spoke briefly in the kitchen, and then they left. I watched the whole thing from a booth at a restaurant, eating my dinner, and I forwarded the time-stamped footage to Mr. Adebayo before I ordered dessert. In Ohio, entering someone's dwelling without permission is criminal trespass. The fact that my stepmother had once been my father's wife and that Cora was his daughter did not extend them any legal right to access property that was now under estate control with me as the designated administrator. Mr. Adebayo filed a police report the next morning. He also filed a motion citing the break-in as evidence of bad faith by the contesting parties, the kind of move that tends to make judges look at a will contest with considerably less sympathy. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after my father passed. I arrived alone. I want to be clear about that, because people asked me afterward why I didn't bring anyone for support, and the honest answer is that I didn't need it. I had a folder. I had Mr. Adebayo. I had 62 pages of documentation and a forensic timeline that I had built the way I'd build any audit, systematically, without emotion, with every claim supported by a source. My stepmother arrived with her attorney, a man named Mr. Follett, who had the practiced ease of someone who did a lot of family court work and expected it to be fairly routine. Cora came with her husband. My brother-in-law sat behind them in the gallery, in a blazer that still had the crease from being unfolded out of a drawer. They looked confident. That was the first thing I noticed. They thought they had something. The hearing opened with Mr. Follett presenting the contest. He was smooth, measured, and he framed the undue influence argument well. I'll give him that. He described my father's medical condition with clinical precision, cited the stroke, cited the cognitive impacts, cited the contracted social world of someone in long-term care who is primarily in contact with one caregiver. He made my 2 years of devotion sound like a deliberate scheme. Then he called the hired doctor to provide expert testimony. Doctor, I won't use his name, took the stand and delivered his opinion with practiced confidence. Based on his review of the records, he had concerns about my father's testamentary capacity during the period when the estate documents were executed. He cited specific notes from the hospital file indicating moments of confusion. Mr. Adebayo waited until Doctor had finished. Then he stood up. He introduced into evidence the doctor's 2 prior licensing board complaints. He introduced documentation showing the doctor had never clinically examined Walter, had never spoken to his treating neurologist, and had billed a flat rate for his opinion, regardless of findings, a structure that, Mr. Adebayo noted, creates a material financial incentive to provide a particular conclusion. Then Mr. Adebayo called Walter's actual neurologist. Dr. Osei had treated my father for 14 months. She had seen him regularly, tracked his cognitive recovery, and had been present or available during the period when the estate documents were revised. She testified under oath that my father had demonstrated consistent decision-making capacity throughout his care, that he had asked her specific and coherent questions about his own prognosis, and that nothing in her clinical assessment suggested he was incapable of executing legal documents. When Mr. Follett tried to cross-examine her on specific moments of confusion noted in the hospital records, she explained, patiently, with the composure of someone who had done this before, that post-stroke patients commonly experience fluctuating states, and that documented moments of confusion during recovery are entirely separate from the legal standard of testamentary capacity, which requires understanding the nature of one's assets and the relationship between oneself and one's heirs. My father, she said, met that standard consistently. Then Mr. Adebayo submitted my documentation, all 62 pages, every medication log with my signature and timestamp, every physician visit note where I had waited outside in the hall, every email in which my father's attorney had independently confirmed meeting with Walter alone, the statement of intent Walter had signed, a letter, which I had not known existed until Mr. Adebayo showed it to me the week before, in which my father had written, in his own slightly unsteady post-stroke handwriting, that his decisions about his estate were his own, made freely, and that he anticipated they might be questioned. My father knew his family. He had prepared for this. The judge read the statement of intent slowly. Then she looked up. She looked at my stepmother first, then at Cora, then at Mr. Follett. She said, "Counsel, your clients entered the deceased's home without authorization after this contest was filed, which your office was fully aware of. Are you prepared to address that?" Mr. Follett was not prepared to address that. He had not been told about the break-in. I watched the moment he realized it, the slight stiffening of his shoulders, the half-turn toward his client that he stopped himself from completing. My stepmother's expression didn't change, but her hands, folded on the table in front of her, pressed together a little harder. The judge denied the contest. She denied it in full, with a written finding that the evidence presented in support of the challenge was insufficient to overcome the presumption of validity attached to the will, and that the conduct of the contesting parties, specifically the unauthorized entry, raised serious concerns about their motivations. She also referred the hired doctor's testimony to the Ohio Medical Board for review. Mr. Follett stood up and immediately began talking to my stepmother in a low voice. She pulled her arm away from him. Cora's husband put his hand on her shoulder and she didn't respond, just stared at the table. My brother-in-law, in the gallery, had his phone out. I sat at the defense table and did not smile, did not cry, did not react. I waited until the judge left the room. Then I closed my folder, stood up, straightened my jacket and picked up my bag. Cora looked at me from across the aisle. It was the first time we'd made real eye contact since the funeral. She started to say something. I don't know what it was because I turned and walked toward the door before she got the words out. Not dramatically. Not angrily. I just didn't have anything to say to her that morning. Maybe ever. The estate cleared probate 11 weeks later. My stepmother lost the contest, absorbed her own legal fees, and retained only the single rental property my father had left her. Within a few months, I heard through a distant cousin that she'd had a falling out with her attorney over the bill. the hired doctor received a formal reprimand from the state licensing board and a suspension of his ability to provide expert testimony in legal proceedings for 2 years. Cora called me 3 times in the months that followed. I let the first 2 go to voicemail. The third time, I picked up. She cried. She said she didn't know the break-in was going to happen. She said my brother-in-law had handled all the legal stuff, and she had just gone along with it. She said she missed Dad and she missed me and she was sorry. I listened to the whole thing, and when she was done, I told her I needed more time and I meant it. Because what she'd done wasn't just legal maneuvering. She had stood in our father's kitchen 4 hours after he died and called me a manipulator. She had implied, to people who might someday repeat it, that I had isolated and exploited a vulnerable old man who was, in fact, one of the best people I have ever known. You don't come back from that in a single phone call. My brother-in-law never contacted me. I consider that the most self-aware thing he has ever done. My brother, who signed the supporting documentation from Phoenix without reading it carefully, eventually called to apologize after the ruling came down. His apology was genuine, I think, and also came with a request to borrow money, which I declined politely. We are cordial now in the way that distant relatives are cordial. That's enough. I still live in my father's house. I repainted the downstairs office back into an office, and I put his chair back by the window where it used to be before his stroke. And sometimes when I'm working late I look up, and for a second I expect to see him sitting there falling asleep over a paperback novel. I manage the 2 rental properties now. I'm in the process of making decisions about the Tennessee land. I do not need anyone's permission. What I think about most, when I think about that night, standing on that porch in the dark holding his cardigan, listening to my family discuss how to dismantle the last thing he gave me, is that grief makes you want to collapse. Every instinct you have when you lose someone tells you to fall apart, to let someone else take over, to defer, and they were counting on that. They had calculated the timing precisely. They genuinely believed that 4 hours was long enough to wait before beginning, but they had spent 2 years watching me take care of someone without breaking. I don't know what they thought that was made of, but it wasn't the kind of thing that evaporates the same night. I'm not someone who believes in cutting family off lightly. I also don't believe that blood is a sufficient reason to excuse someone who stood in your dead father's kitchen and called you a predator. Those 2 things can both be true. I'm still working out which relationships have enough real substance left to be worth rebuilding, and which ones were always just proximity pretending to be love. My father left me a note. I've read it probably 40 times. Near the end, he wrote, "You never asked me to notice what you were doing. I noticed anyway. That's all. That's the whole thing. If you've ever had to protect something important from the people who are supposed to help you protect it, tell me your story in the comments. And if this resonated with you, subscribe to Recovery Stories. I'll be back with another one soon." There's something nobody prepares you for when you lose a parent, which is how fast everyone around you reveals exactly who they are. Not gradually. All at once, in the space of a single night, like a curtain dropping. I think about my sister Cora a lot, not with anger anymore. That part faded somewhere around the 3rd month. What I think about is the version of her I believed in for 31 years, and how completely that version dissolved the moment the stakes got real. She wasn't a villain. That's the complicated part. She was a person who, when given the choice between doing the right thing and doing the convenient thing, chose convenience and told herself it was justified. Most betrayals don't come from evil people. They come from ordinary people who talk themselves into it. My stepmother is the same. She calculated what she thought she deserved based on what she'd invested, decided the math didn't add up in her favor, and started looking for a workaround. That's not monstrous. It's just deeply, quietly dishonest. And the hired doctor who signed his name to an opinion he'd never earned, he made a professional decision that he could absorb the risk. Turns out the Ohio Medical Board disagreed. What I keep coming back to is cause and effect, stripped of drama. Every single person in this story made choices that had consequences. My brother-in-law pushed the hardest and lost the most. Time, money, reputation, his wife's relationship with her only sibling. My stepmother spent more on attorneys than she would have spent simply accepting what my father left her. The doctor traded his credibility for $4,500. When you line it up like that, the outcome isn't surprising, it's almost mathematical. And on my side of the ledger, I showed up for 2 years. I kept records not because I suspected anything, but because that's how I'm wired. Because I believe that careful attention to the real world, the documented, verifiable, factual world, is one of the most protective things a person can practice. My father raised me to read the fine print. My career trained me to find what people hide. I didn't plan any of this. I just lived the way I always lived, and when it mattered, that turned out to be enough. I think that's what I want to say most clearly, because I've seen this framed as a revenge story, and it isn't one. Revenge requires intention. What happened in that courtroom wasn't something I did to them. It was the natural conclusion of what they did to themselves, documented and presented to a judge who could read. I just refused to collapse when they expected me to. I kept my composure when every part of me wanted to scream, and I trusted that the truth, organized and evidenced and brought into the light, would do what truth does when it's given the right conditions. My father left me a note. He noticed. That's the part I return to when things are still hard, when the house is quiet and I look at his chair by the window. He noticed what I was doing without me ever asking him to. That kind of witness, someone who simply sees you clearly, is rarer than money, rarer than property, rarer than anything in a will. I hope you have someone like that. And if you don't yet, I hope you become that person for yourself first. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment and tell me yours. Subscribe to Recovery Stories. I'll be here.